It's August the 3rd, 2005. We're in the William James Hall of Harvard University, and we're talking to our old friend and colleague, Professor Herb Kelman, one of the pioneers and certainly one of the parents of the field of conflict analysis and resolution. All right, looking back into the early days of the field, people came into the field from all sorts of different disciplinary backgrounds. Now, where did you come from and how did you get involved in the field in the first place?
Basically, when I was in college, and particularly this was in the immediate post-war period, I started college in '43, so I was very interested. After the war, particularly, I became very actively involved in peace movement and the civil rights movement, and I wanted very much to do something with my life that would be relevant to issues of peace and social justice and social change. And I decided, you know, there was a particular conversation that I had with someone, but all of that is not terribly important, but I decided, I was persuaded that the way to do that was through academic work in either psychology or sociology, and I picked psychology, partly because, you know, by then I was already in my second year in college, and I'd had some psychology, I'd had no sociology, so it was easier for me to finish a degree in psychology. I ended up actually, my undergraduate degree, with a joint major in psychology and English literature, which is where I started. And in psychology, of course, from the very beginning, it was very clear to me that what I was interested in was social psychology, and particularly social psychology concerned with social issues. So even as an undergraduate, I learned about SPICY. I don't know if you've heard about SPICY, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. Okay, yeah. And I joined that when I was still an undergraduate, still a junior, largely through the influence of Daniel Katz, who was my mentor in college, and that, you know, and continued to be a very, very important person in my life. So when I finished college, I applied to graduate school in places that had social psychology programs, and I decided to go to Yale. There I became socialized, you know, as a good, well-trained, standard experimental social psychologist, but continuing, you know, my interest in social change. I was working on attitude change, doing experimental work in the field of attitude change, persuasion, and communication, but also remained active politically in issues of peace and race relations and so on. I'd had some history in that work before I went to college, and I continued my activity. And in 1951, I think it was early '51, which was my last year, just before I got my degree, Arthur Gladstone, who was a fellow student, he was a couple of years ahead of me, and we had become good friends. We had started a co-op house together with two other people in New Haven, and we both had declared as conscientious objectors at the time of the Korean War. Anyway, we decided to write a letter to the American Psychologist, which is, you know, the house organ of the American Psychological Association, in which our basic argument was that pacifists base their approach on certain assumptions, some of which are psychological assumptions. And these are potentially subject to systematic research on the part of psychologists. And wouldn't it be interesting for psychologists to devote some of their efforts to testing out some of these hypotheses, if you will, to testing out some of these ideas? And that, you know, we published that, I forget if it was an article or a letter, perhaps, a long letter, actually, in the American Psychologist. It produced a number of responses, some favorable, some unfavorable, but the most interesting ones were from people who said, this is a great idea, we ought to get together and do something about it. Anyway, one thing led to another. We had a first meeting sometime in the fall of 19 1951 at the meetings of the American Psychological Association. By that time, I'd already had gotten my degree in 51. And we met a couple of times, and by 1952, we had established a small organization called the Research Exchange on the Prevention of War. And that little organization mostly consisted of young psychologists and other social scientists. It tended to be more psychologists because we did it around the, the activities of the American Psychological Association. One of the older people who joined us very early in the game was Ted Lenz. I don't know if you ever ran into Ted Lenz.
Yes, I did.
Ted Lenz was really a prophet of all of this, and here he found a bunch of young people who were interested in it. Anyway, we started by putting out a bulletin, the Bulletin of the Research Exchange on the Prevention of War. We organized symposia at conferences, at one of which, for example, we had Quincy Wright speaking. We organized 1 or 2 summer workshops. And so we were going, and I began writing a little bit, mostly on what can social scientists contribute to, to international relations more generally, and to issues of war and peace more specifically, trying in a sense to find a niche for social psychological contributions. Anyway, so we went, and it was a modest organization, but we continued to work. And at one point, 2 graduate students at the University of Michigan, Bob Hefner and Bill Barth, don't know if you ever ran into them.
I don't think I did.
I've lost touch with them, actually. But anyway, they took over the mechanics of putting out the bulletin. They were able to, we started out with the mimeographed sheets. Remember those days?
I do remember them.
They advanced our technology by making it into a photo offset production, actually with a cover and everything else. It became
Quantum leap.
Quantum leap, exactly. Anyway, in 1954, I had the good fortune of being invited to the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, which was a very good place for developing new ideas, and especially it reinforced my interdisciplinary bent, which was always from the very beginning, as I mentioned to you, I was kind of choosing between psychology and sociology, and in graduate school I did a lot of anthropology actually. So anyway, the center reinforced that, but we had a very good relationship with people there, and we were able to talk about all kinds of things. I was one of the youngest people. I was in my 20s, but then there were some quite senior people, including Kenneth Boulding, who was at that time not as senior as he became later, but he was already he was already a pretty senior established person in the field, and Anatole Rappaport. Anyway, and I might add, a younger person named Steve Richardson, who was the son of Louis Richardson, whose name you recognize,
Indeed.
And who had come there with 2, Louis Richardson had died, and had left 2 unpublished manuscripts, one on escalation, I forget the names, something about the deadly conflicts, the statistics of deadly conflicts or something like that. Anyway, these 2 manuscripts. Anyway, I got these people, Boulding, Rappaport, Richardson, and a number of other younger people together for a series of meetings, which started with my telling them about the research exchange and telling them a little bit about my frustration. I had really 2 frustrations. I mean, I was young, and things were moving too slowly for me. Now I realized that really we had moved quite a bit. We started in 51, and this was 54, early 55, and started really from nowhere. But my frustrations were, one, that the people in the research exchange mostly were talking about things one ought to do, but weren't doing it. And secondly, that we hadn't really attracted the specialists in the field. In other words, we were both mostly, psychologists, sociologists, an occasional educator or whatever, occasional anthropologist. By the way, I think Raoul Marot was also in that group, an anthropologist who later did very important work you know, kind of statistical work on the rise and fall of civilizations kind of things. Anyway, so these were my issues. How can we attract some of the specialists in the field, and how can we get moving into doing things? Anyway, one thing led to another. We had these discussions, and in the meantime, I should say, Boulding and Rappaport, who were already interested, of course, and especially, you know, out of, you know, Boulding was a Quaker, and Rappaport was a pacifist, a term that Ted Lenz used to use. You know,
I've never come across that. Pacifist.
It was Ted Lenz's invention, and so they were very interested in the idea, but they were also very stimulated by those Richardson manuscripts, which showed the possibilities of using indeed quantitative methods to study issues highly relevant to war and peace. And anyway, the decision was made to start a new journal, which would in effect replace the bulletin of the Research Exchange by becoming a more formal journal with a broader scope and so on and so forth, but fulfill some of the functions of the Research Exchange, which was to promote a new field, as it were. And we decided, this was 55, and we decided to place the journal at the University of Michigan because Boulding was there, Rappaport was about to go there, and we already had a kind of a little bit of an infrastructure with Bob Hefner and Bill Barth, the two graduate students who had been putting out who'd been doing the mechanical work on putting out, not just mechanical, but editorial work on putting out the bulletin. So we decided to go to the University of Michigan. Being at the center, we were able to attract a very impressive, we were able to attract a very impressive advisory board. You know, Harold Laswell was on our board, and all sorts of people. So we had a very nice advisory board, and then, you know, when Boulding and Rappaport got back to Ann Arbor, they got a local group together, you know, Bob Angel and Dan Katz, of course, and let's see, no, not David Siga came later. So the journal got started. Anyway.
Now, you called it the Journal of Conflict Resolution rather than the Journal of Peace Studies. Was that a deliberate decision?
It's a good question. It was a deliberate decision. There were several reasons. By the way, there was a subtitle, I don't remember what it was, a journal devoted to the study of war and peace or something like that. The word peace was in the subtitle. But I think there were two factors. One was a, you know, a kind of intellectual factor in the sense that both Boulding and Rappaport had interest in the study of conflict. And for Boulding, for example, who was very interested in general systems theory, he had in fact run a seminar in Michigan before he came to the center on conflict at different levels of scientific discourse. You know, in other words, he was looking for concepts that ran across all different levels. And conflict was one such concept. So conflict was, you know, was a theoretically very relevant and interesting concept. But there was another factor, and this was the tail end of the McCarthy era. And I'm quite sure, I mean, this has been my narrative for some time, so I don't know whether, but I'm quite sure that this was a factor in leaving out peace of the title. It was also a factor when we first did the Research Exchange on the Prevention of War. We didn't call it the Peace Research Exchange. And that was deliberate, I think, because peace in those days was had negative connotations, and it put you into a you know, into a questionable category. And we thought we had enough trouble, you know, trying to promote something that was really out of the mainstream, and that we didn't want to get involved in being, you know, sort of becoming suspect because of our words. And I think that was a factor. in our choice of conflict resolution rather than peace research, for example.
Yeah.
But there was no question in our minds that this is what we were, this is what we're doing, this is where we came from.
Yeah. Oh, it's interesting because there has been this sort of tendency to sort of, for the two to seem to grow in parallel. You know, peace studies and conflict studies seem, in many people's eyes, I think, to be slightly different from one another. I mean,
well, it wasn't in that case. I mean,
okay.
and you have to remember, you know, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, I mean, even if you look at it now, even more so if you look at it now, I would say, is really, you know, the thing that is its greatest strength is quantitative peace research, really. It's not particularly interested in conflict resolution as we know it, you know, the practice or the scholar practitioner type of activities that we are involved in. That's not its, you know, I mean, it will publish occasional things on it. In fact, I intend to submit something to the Journal of Conflict Resolution.
Good luck.
Well, you know, I don't know. I think I have a good chance of getting it. You know, I think Anatole Rappaport and I, if I'm not mistaken, are the only surviving members of the original editorial board. I'm still on the editorial board.
Oh, you? I didn't.
I guess they don't want to throw me off because I'm a founding father.
Okay. Well, yes, you are indeed.
So anyway, so in a way, it's that conflict didn't exist there because that wasn't the field of conflict resolution that we had in mind. We had in mind conflict resolution as essentially the peaceful resolution of international conflicts or conflicts at other levels. You know, there was always an interest kind of in looking at the comparison between different levels. So anyway, if I may turn, did you want to ask something else?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I'm always slightly interested in the way the two have slightly grown apart over the last 30 years. And I think, you know, my own memory is that got a significant boost in the 70s when the Scandinavians came into the picture. But that's just my own personal memory. You're definitely right. And there are several different dimensions in this. One of which is I think that sort of at least some of the peace studies people tend to be a little bit suspicious of the quantitative analytical approaches and all of that. So there are a whole bunch of issues involved there. Sure.
And also some of the more ideologically oriented peace studies people tend to be suspicious of the notion of conflict resolution, which which they sometimes see as a way of conflict resolution essentially is a way of diluting conflicts, calming things down without really seriously addressing them, which work to the advantage of the powerful and the disadvantage of the powerless. I mean, that was an issue, certainly. I remember at one time having sort of a debate on this issue with the person who was the director or executive of COPRED at one point. I can't remember who she was, what her name was.
Oh, Maura Dugan. Was it Maura?
No, it wasn't. No. I think we didn't have any conflict with her about these issues. I think she was in both camps, I would say.
Yeah.
And I consider myself to be in both camps. But anyway, I want to go on just a little bit. So this is where I came from, essentially, is that field. In terms of my own activities, you know, I wasn't trained in international relations, and I wasn't trained in this kind of research, and I was kind of slowly trying to find ways of making my work more and more relevant, while continuing to do other kinds of activities, particularly my work on attitude change and social influence and, you know, experimental work in this area, etc. But my first effort to kind of bridge these interests was work on international student exchange and subsequently educational and cultural exchange. And for a number of years, I did work in these areas, which, you know, have obvious links to functional theory and international relations. I think I was always aware, certainly I was aware very early on, about the limitations of this, that you don't make peace just by bringing people together and letting them experience the other culture and so on. That, I was always aware of the fact that conflict is not based entirely on lack of familiarity with the other and lack of personal relations and so on. It was actually an issue that I've had to struggle with over the years, because many people tend to assume, it's an issue that I have to struggle with as a psychologist coming into this field, because people tend to assume that if you're a psychologist, you must be explaining everything in psychological terms. And I still, it really drives me up the wall when people describe my work as being an effort to bring people together so they'll get to know each other and like each other and therefore make peace. Yes. So that has never been my view. And so I was always, very cautious and in my analysis of where do these kinds of activities make a potential contribution. Yes. And I do think they do make a potential contribution, broadly related to functional theories, which I also take with a grain of salt. But so that was my one kind of activity, and that bridged my interest in attitude change and social influence with my interest in international relations. The second sort of line of work really began in earnest when I moved to the University of Michigan in '62. Okay. And where by that time the Center for Research on Conflict Resolution had been established. Of course, I'd had long-standing relations with the University of Michigan, the social psychologist, and Dan Katz being a major figure. And so Dan and I, with the collaboration of some of our students, originally Richard Flax, later John de la Mater, and other people, developed a program, a project, series of studies on nationalism and the relationship of the individual to the national political system.
That's right. I remember that article you wrote for and published in Jim Rosenau's book.
Exactly. Yeah, that was my first. So, well, it wasn't my first. I mean, my first articles were actually jointly written with Dan Katz and some of our other people. But that was my first sort of reformulation of some of these issues in a slightly different framework. So that was my second venture in the direction, because obviously nationalism and national identity are central issues in international conflict. The other activity that I pursued from the very beginning, starting in the early 1950s, was an interest in trying to define the place of social psychology in all of this. In other words, my view was always that, international conflict is not a psychological issue per se, but it is an issue, if you will, that has psychological, and from my point of view, particularly social psychological dimensions. And that it's our task, really, to try to define the appropriate point of entry for psychological analysis. In other words, I was always very much, in the subsequent years, in all of my teaching on international conflict, I always started, with a long sermon about the dangers of over-psychologizing, and my operational definition of over-psychologizing is, if you use psychology more than I do, then you're over-psychologizing. So I was always pointing to the dangers of over-psychologizing, and I'm always saying these are not psychological issues per se, but they have psychological dimensions. But in order to be relevant, theoretically, we have to have the larger picture and see at what point psychological analysis can make an appropriate contribution. So it's an issue, it's a point of defining the relevant points of entry. And this, incidentally, has become also relevant to practice, to which I want to turn now. I'm just about to begin to answer your question, yes.
All right, let me slip another one in if I can. I mean, following up on your point about not over-psychologizing, whose ideas at this stage in your career do you think were influential in the way you thought about things? I mean, you've talked about Dan Katz.
People who influenced me in those years, well, I mean, I can name a number of different people. Harold Gutzkow comes to mind. I had contact with him rather early. I mean, I don't even know if you know that Harold Gutzkow is a social psychologist by training. He is a social psychologist.
Okay, Dan Druckmann told me he was.
Yeah,
okay.
but he went all the way.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, in other words, I tried to educate myself some, but Harold really remade himself. And so to the point where a lot of people don't even know that he's a social psychologist. Richard Snyder had, you know, I got to know and had an influence on me. Carl Deutsch, Boulding, of course. Then let's see who would be some other people from these earlier years. Later on, Ralph White and Irving Janis. They were all people, by the way, I mean, all the names I mentioned are people who contributed to my book, International Behavior, which I should also have mentioned in this context. But I mean, part of my effort to try to define the place of social psychology in the field was to put out this book, which we started actually in 1959, but was published in 1965.
6 years, yes.
Yeah. So this was a really constructed book. This was not a set of conference papers. This was a book which, you know, with the help of a number of colleagues here, we worked out a framework, and I had a definite framework into which I tried to then solicit contributions that would fit into this framework, and the purpose was to present, if you will, the state of the art of social psychological contributions to international relations.
It was a hell of a good book.
It was called, thank you, it was called International Behavior, a Social Psychological Analysis. And a number of the people I mentioned were on the board, and also a number of them had on the advisory board, and a number of them had chapters in that book, and some of them brought in some of their younger associates, like Harold Gutzkow brought in Jack Sawyer, and Dick Snyder brought in Jim Robinson, Carl Deutsch brought in Richard Merritt. So you know, Bruce Smith also had a chapter in there with Irving Janis. So this book was really another effort to define the contributions, the potential contributions of social psychology. I think I named some of the important people.
Okay.
David Singer, by the way, is another category, because David Singer actually, although he's a little older than I am, not much, but a little.
A little.
But he, you know, he was trained as a traditional IR person, you know, at Columbia. But then he somehow saw the light, and he came, and while I was at Harvard in the 50s, you know, I was at Harvard 57 to 62, then I left to Michigan, and then I came back. So while I was at Harvard in the 50s, or I mean, I think right when I came, 57 or thereabouts, David was here as a postdoctoral fellow trying to learn about behavioral science, about social science. And he got, I think it was Gordon Allport or Jerry Bruner, I don't know, directed him to me. And so we became friends, and all that. And then he moved to the University of Michigan, and then we sort of reconnected. So these are some of the people. You know, names may, you know, I may have left out some important figures, but these are some of the people that come to mind. Anyway, but this brings me right up to this sort of critical, really turning point. 65, the book came out. In 66, John Burton came to Ann Arbor. I'm pretty sure it was David Singer who hosted him.
Right.
I don't exactly know, you know, I mean, it's not surprising that they made contact through various kinds of peace research activities or things of that sort.
Might have been Kenneth.
Might have been Kenneth that brought him there.
Could be.
Well, it's conceivable. It's conceivable. I don't know. I don't connect Kenneth with this. I connect
David.
I connect David. I mean, it was David who invited me to his house where I first met John Burton. So that's why I connect him with it. Burton, I had some vague familiarity. I mean, he had published a couple of books by that time, more than a couple probably. But he was the book that I remember most had to do with looking at the world as a global society. I forget what the name of it was.
International relations, a general theory, would that be the one?
It could have been that, or anyway.
The one before that was called peace theory, I think, or something like that.
Yeah, there was something like that, which clearly he was searching within the social sciences for ideas, for the study of international relations, and clearly he was developing the concept of the international system as a society, with all of the features of a society. So I mean, this is where he started and where he came from. So I had a vague familiarity with what he was doing, but I can't say that I was deeply knowledgeable about his work. He, in the meantime, had seen my book, the International Behavior book. Anyway, we met, and he told me about this method that he was developing and that he had applied once in relation to the conflict between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. I don't know whether at the time he used the term controlled communication.
That came later.
That came later. But he told me about the method, basically. And I remember that I kind of saw the light. I mean, I thought, this is it. I mean, I had been interested in the, social psychological approaches to international relations theory, but here was what I regarded as a social psychological approach to international relations practice. Because I saw it, at least in my parochial view, I saw it as social psychological by virtue of the fact that it was making use of the dynamics of small groups, and that it was making use of interpersonal interaction, changing ideas in individuals, which of course then have implications. But it was working at the level of individuals in interaction with each other in the context of small groups. So to me, this was a social psychological approach. And in a way, although I'm not sure that I had ever consciously been searching for it, but if I hadn't been consciously searching for it, I should have been, because, in effect, I was always interested in practice, if you will. I was always interested. I mean, I went into the field because I was interested in peace, and so clearly that spoke to me. And so when John then invited me to come to Cyprus for the exercise on the Cyprus conflict that was scheduled for November of '66, I accepted enthusiastically. I might add, incidentally, two other people with whom I'd had contact in these earlier years and who influenced me and also came to that meeting, as you know, Chad Alger. Chad Alger, of course, I first met when he was still a student or a young faculty member at Northwestern, and Bob North. And Dave Singer, John invited Dave Singer, but Dave was off flying in those days, and so he didn't want to go, and so I went. So that was basically a major turning point for me. But I think, as I hope I have demonstrated in all the words that I have produced here, there was, I was waiting for it. I mean, this was a turning point, but it was one that really was, I think, a very, very direct, natural outgrowth of what I had been doing and thinking about and hoping to do.
Okay, well, I want to come back to the practice, but can we just go back to the development of the field a little bit? Because, I mean, you came into it with a particular slant, even though you were obviously very keen to keep your psychological slant well under control. But I think one of the things that strikes me about the development of the field in the early days, and still, is that it's always claimed to be multidisciplinary. And that means it borrows, you know, ideas, concepts, theories from all over the place. Can you, looking back on, I think I'm asking the same question again, can you think about particular ideas that have influenced the way in which you think about the field and think about your work in it, which are not psychological? I mean, you know, just as an afterthought, I always think that we overdo this multidisciplinary thing because I think we never escape our real discipline. But I'm not, and have never been trained as a psychologist, but I sometimes find that the most useful ideas that I have come from psychology. I'm an international relationist. What's the cross-fertilization from your point of view?
It's interesting. What are some... Well, I don't know. I mean, you know, offhand, nothing strikes me, you know, except, you know, things that have kind of played a major role in my thinking, except for the fact that I have always emphasized that whatever we do in our practice and indeed in our theoretical analysis as social psychologists occurs within a societal and organizational and systemic context. And so, you know, my very first kind of published article, my first articles kind of in this field were in the Bulletin of the Research Exchange on the Prevention of War, which is a more informal thing. But my first more formal article in this field was called Societal, Attitudinal, and Structural Factors in International Relations. And that was in 1955, I think, that it was published.
Journal of Social Issues?
It was published in Journal of Social Issues. Okay. And a big boost to my morale was that Stanley Hoffman, in what I think may have been his first book, reprinted it. You know, he did a sort of an essay on theories in international relations.
That's right, yes.
With readings, contemporary
yes.
theories in international relations, and the fact that he regarded this as a theory in international relations, you know, I was always coming into this field feeling a little bit, you know, out of place. I mean, you know, I'm a mere psychologist. What do I do in here? So that was very pleasing to me. But the point is that even in that article, right at the beginning, I emphasized, you know, obviously attitudinal factors were my domain, but that we're dealing with societal and structural factors. So that social structures, you know, were always important. And this was always my critique, you know, of you know, the great man theories. That, of course, I believe people make a difference. But I was always, you know, very, you know, took pains to emphasize that they do occur in a particular historical context and in a particular institutional context and so on. So none of this is very exciting because these are basically, you know, for me, these are background factors. They're terribly important, you know, and as I said, in my teaching, you know, I was teaching a course in social psychology, but they played a very important part in my teaching. And of course, you know, I also made some use of notions of national indicators, you know, you know, that measures measures at the system level and so on. But I'm not able to come up with a concept. I mean, like if you ask me what psychological concepts, I could come up with needs, for example, as a very big input. But I can't come up with a comparable concept, or well, again, many of the concepts are concepts that I work with. More and more in recent years, I've worked with identity.
Yeah.
Now, but for me, identity is a concept that exists at several levels. I mean, clearly it exists at the level of the individual, but it exists at the level of groups, organizations, collectivities, and societies. And more and more it's now being used, so much so I have some colleagues here at Harvard who are trying to find a measure of national identity that would be comparable to the GNP. Some kind of measure that you could have, some quantitative measure that would sort of play the role of GNP. So it's a concept that has taken on a meaning at that level, at the macro level, and there are other concepts that have meanings at the micro and at the macro level. Ideology, obviously, nationalism, but at the moment I'm not coming up with something that's uniquely kind of at that.
I find things affect me by a kind of process of osmosis. I don't realize I pick them up, and then I suddenly find myself thinking, oh, I remember that was useful. Where did that come from? Anyway, go back to here we are, back in 1966. You've actually been to John's second workshop. So then what? What happened personally to your intellectual journey? Then what happened to the field? And in between that, you then become very much involved in the Middle East and work in the Middle East, which sort of bridges the sort of practical, theoretical side. So tell us what happened next in those things.
Yeah. So, I mean, I came back from the London conference really very stimulated and excited and somewhat critical. I mean, in the sense that, I felt there were certain issues that hadn't been that needed to be resolved. I mean, certain open questions about methodology and about assumptions and so on. But on the whole, really very, very excited. I, of course, was, I was very busy with all sorts of other commitments and activities. And in fact, shortly after, I can't remember, I guess traveling must have been easier in those days than it is today for me. Because I think I first came home and then went off to Nigeria because in December, yes, this was in November. This was November, I think, right, of '66. I came home, and towards the end of December, latter part of December, I had this international conference on social psychological research in developing countries, which I'd been involved in, which I chaired and co-organized and so on, that took place in Nigeria. Somewhere along the way, I stopped in Spain, I remember. And then early in the spring, I went off to California for another stay at the Center for Advanced Study in the behavioral sciences. So it was, I was doing other things. But in '67, in the summer of '67, I was in California, in Palo Alto, and the Six-Day War, the Arab-Israeli War of '67, was on the screen. It also was taking place in real life, but I saw it on the screen. And at that point, it hit me that isn't this an arena where Burton's approach might be applicable. And I should mention, just to put on the record without going into detail, but I have a very strong Jewish background. I was born in Vienna in a Jewish family, was a refugee from Nazi, after the Anschluss, grew up in the Zionist youth movement, and, spoke and in fact wrote Hebrew, spoke fluently, wrote Hebrew articles. My first 2 articles were in Hebrew as a student. So, I mean, I have a very thorough Jewish, Zionist background. And I was, so I mean, to me, this was a very important event. And like most Jews at that time, there was a tremendous concern about the future of Israel, because we didn't realize how well armed and prepared Israel was. But of course, I also was, my orientation was towards conflict resolution. And since I mentioned my first 2 articles, which were in Hebrew, published in 1945, one was called On the Question of Arab-Jewish Cooperation.
45?
45, yes. And I mean, there were within the Zionist movement, there were people like Martin Buber, the name you're, I'm sure, familiar with, and others who were, proposing a binational state, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there were different trends within the Zionist movement, and these were the trends that attracted me. And by the way, the other article that I published in Hebrew was called In Defense of Nationalism, which was sort of an attempt to distinguish between good nationalism and bad nationalism, et cetera. Anyway, so I got in touch with John to ask, is there something we can do? And he actually managed to raise some money from Carnegie, I believe, to pursue something, but it never got anywhere. I mean, the main problem was that I had no contacts, no significant contacts in the Arab world, and John had some, but they weren't enough, really, to mount an event. I mean, one of the things, maybe the most important thing I learned from that exercise was that it takes a very, very great deal of preparation. That you can't become an instant diplomat, even unofficial diplomat, overnight. And so we talked about it. We tried, and money might have become a problem if we'd actually gone into the field, but it wasn't the big problem. Some seed money was there that John raised. So nothing came of that.
I think before the 6-Day War, John had established some good contacts in Cairo.
Yes.
Right, but they weren't the important ones. He was trying after the war to make some contacts with some of the Palestinians in London. But I think my memory is that the Palestinians at that particular stage were so badly disorganized that there was no there.
Yeah.
And so that, I think, was one of the reasons why nothing came of that, because I was partly involved in it as a kind of a gopher. And I would go and listen to these meetings of the Palestinian exile community in London, arguing with each other about which way they wanted to go, and it was really, that was one of the problems anyway. Sorry, I mean,
please. Yeah. Well, anyway, the seed had been sown. I mean, this was the first time I thought about it in relation to the Middle East, but I didn't stop thinking about it, afterwards. Then, I'm trying to remember, it was either 69 or 70, that I went on a trip, also either 69 or 70, I have to get these straight. There was another little experience. I mean, it's in Cyprus. A whole bunch of people were taking an interest in Cyprus. people developing ideas about conflict and conflict resolution, because Cyprus seemed like an ideal laboratory. You know, it's this little island that's sort of relatively self-contained, and you know, so Cyprus was of interest to a lot of people. And there was in the summer of '69 or '70, I can't remember right now which one it was, that a group of people, including a you know, Cyprus-born, I think, political scientist here in this country, organized a kind of a summer floating seminar in Kyrenia, to which it was over several weeks, and they invited different people to come to it and speak and so on. So anyway, it was really a side story, because what I wanted to mention was my trip to Israel, which was also in '69 or '70, in which I began to talk to various people about the idea, this kind of an idea. And I got different kinds of reactions. One very positive one, which I might say from Shimon Shamir, whom you remember, and who has continued to work with me over the years until today. A very negative one, and one that was sort of mixed. The negative one really influenced me because it was one that told me basically, don't mix into our business. You know, this is a matter of life and death for Israelis and Palestinians, and we don't like these, you know, American Jews hopping in and trying to solve our problem. If you want to do anything, you ought to come here and live here, or at the very least, make a real commitment. It's not something you ought to be doing with your left hand. And that kind of criticism really influenced me. So I wasn't ready to spend a lot of time on it. So I really, for a couple of years, didn't do, well, did two things. I mean, two things happened. If we look at the period, like the end of the '60s, the beginning of the '70s, one was that I wrote my first paper, and this was Richard Merritt had invited me to participate in a panel at the in LA at the meetings of the American Political Science Association, and was later published in his book on communication and international relations. And so that was a paper called The Problem-Solving Workshop in International Conflict, I think. And I basically tried to compare Burton and Doob's methods. I think it was pretty clear that I was leaning much more towards Burton method, although I adopted Doob's terminology of problem-solving workshop, and then wrote my own kind of implications and so on, in which I began to develop some of my own ideas. And I think, looking back on it, I think the most important thing from my point of view in that paper was that I began to address the question of the relationship between change and transfer of the change, you know, between what happens at the workshop itself and how the ideas developed there become transferred. And I think I developed this, of course, much more fully later, but I think I was aware of the fact that there could be these contradictory requirements for maximizing change and maximizing transfer, which I still consider to have been, you know, perhaps my most important theoretical contribution here to the analysis. At least that's...
Well, it certainly made anybody who did it subsequently think hard about both those issues.
So anyway, so I did that paper. Now, before it was published, I showed a draft of that, I mean, not the text, the pre-publication text of the paper, to Stephen Cohen. Steve Cohen was completing his doctoral work here in the Department of Social Relations with Freed Bales. I didn't really know him well, because by the time I had arrived at Harvard, he was already, you know, I'd arrived at '69, and he was already working on his dissertation, so I didn't know him well, but he was appointed an instructor and later assistant professor in the department. And we agreed to teach a seminar together on international relations, social psychological approaches to international relations. And when he read my paper, he became very excited about it and said, you know, we should try a workshop in conjunction with the seminar.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of the basis for my very first solo seminar, workshop. And we agreed, in fact, Steve was very interested in the Arab-Israeli conflict and was sort of active politically, you know, in it and kind of trying to arrange meetings between the two sides. But this was remote from his academic work. So we decided to try a workshop kind of as an exercise, you know, as a pilot workshop. We had a very small group of students at the time, and of course we had not planned any of it before. The only thing we went into, the only thing that we decided in advance was that we did not want it on the Middle East, because we felt that Steve and I, as two Jews, were not the appropriate third party for an Arab-Israeli kind of thing. But as it happened, the students in the seminar, at least that's my narrative, persuaded us that we should do it on the Middle East, partly because a couple of the students were themselves interested in it, and maybe they sensed that we were really interested in it ourselves. Well, be that as it may, we decided to do it on the Middle East conflict, and we did bring in two Lebanese scholars, a very, very senior, you know, leading person. I'm not sure I knew at the time how important a figure he was. It was Albert Urani, a famous Middle East historian from Oxford, who was a visiting professor here, and then a younger, also Lebanese political scientist, agreed to be consultants. And Hurani himself and the other fellow, maybe for part of time, Hurani actually sat in on the whole workshop, but not as a member of the third party, not as an observer consultant. So he would speak when spoken to, you know, I mean, he would make some observations, but the third party, the facilitators, were Steve and I. But at least we got some input, some Arab input. Of course, we didn't realize at the time that Lebanese Christians are not exactly the main actors on the Arab side, but be that as it may, this was at least we had an awareness of the fact that there were some problems here. Anyway, that workshop was held in this room. Was I think in many ways very successful. At least, you know, the way I used to describe it when people ask me, you know, was it successful, was to say, well, when the beginning of the workshop came, everybody was here. And when the event was over, everybody was still here. And so that, to me, was a success. Actually, it's not entirely correct that everybody was here, because originally, we planned to have 3 teams, Israeli, Palestinian, and Egyptian. We actually had pre-workshop sessions with each of them. You know, I always have this has remained my, as you know, my sort of design to have a pre-workshop session with each group. On its own. The Egyptians came to the pre-workshop session and then dropped out. My post facto, I think it took me a while before I developed that idea. My post facto analysis of why that happened is that, of course, they were busy, you know, there were other commitments, whatever, but I think the reason was that they decided that, or maybe they were even advised, that this was a no-win situation for the Egyptians, because 71, this was in 71, Nasser was already beginning to think about ways of finding some accommodation with Israel. But publicly, in a session in which, I mean public to the extent that there were Palestinians present, they had to play the pan-Arab role. And so they were in a situation in which they had an agenda with the Israelis, but they couldn't fulfill that agenda because of the presence of the Palestinians. And so I think they very rightly decided that this was not going to be a productive situation for them. And as a matter of fact, I think I may at some point even check that out, because one of the Egyptian participants, who was then a graduate student in Canada, actually, is now a leading Egyptian political scientist. You might say perhaps the leading Egyptian political scientist. And I think even in those days, he was at least very savvy about the situation, and he may have consulted. I wouldn't be surprised if he consulted with some people. So I can still check out with him if I have an opportunity to see him again, whether this is actually the reason why they dropped out. But anyway, it ended up in an Israeli-Palestinian workshop. Many other things that I learned from that. I mean, this was one. And by the way, it contributed to my having a very strong bias. I'm not sure whether John has that bias too, but a very strong bias towards doing only bilateral, avoiding trilateral meetings. This is not because I'm not aware of the fact that all conflicts are multilateral, but a workshop is not an effort to reproduce the conflict. But it's, at least in my analysis, the purpose of a workshop is to create new ideas and to develop new thinking. And so you need the special kind of setting for it. And that is, of course, an abstraction from the reality, but the whole thing is an abstraction from the reality. And my feeling is that the moment you introduce three parties, you get at least three separate relationships, and time is too short anyway. I have never, ever, in my whole years of work in this, had the luxury that we had in London for that Cyprus exercise of having a whole week. Do you remember? It was a whole week.
A whole week.
I can never get people to come for a week. I mean, there's just absolutely no way. I have never succeeded. The closest was the time in Bellagio that you were there, if you remember.
Yes.
Where I think we had 5 days.
Yeah, Monday to Friday.
Yeah. So that was the closest. That was good. Boy, that was good. I think it was one of the best experiences that we had. But usually, if I can get them for 3 days, I'm lucky.
Yeah.
So anyway, in that time, I try to simplify it and therefore only work with two parties, even though often there is a temptation to get a third party into the deal. The other thing I learned in that very first workshop was the central role of the PLO. This was 1971, and I still had to learn it. This happened as part of the recruitment process. We were aiming at that time, we were not aiming for influentials. We were aiming for what I now call pre-influentials. So we were looking for sort of senior graduate students. And by the way, we succeeded. I mean, some of the people who were in that workshop, like, well, the one who didn't come, the Egyptian, but also on the other side, turned out to be senior
10 years later.
Sometime later. But we were aiming for graduate students, basically. We found a graduate student, a somewhat older graduate student, Palestinian here at the time, who was very interested in the project and wanted to participate. And we tried to get him to help us recruit other Palestinians. And he said, it'll be extremely hard because Palestinians didn't want to sit with Israelis in those days. That meant, they didn't even use the word Israel. I mean, that meant recognizing Israel.
Yeah.
And so they didn't want to do it. But he said, if you can get this guy, whom I know, who is an official in the PLO office at the UN, if you can get him to come, then I can get you the other participants. So off I went to New York, and I met with this man, and I got him to come. And he is a very, very, very interesting person. I mean, there's a whole story about that, but I think I won't go into that. But, and then we got the team. And so then we also raised, on the Israeli side, we got one faculty member, one young professor involved. So it's to kind of even out the level of the participation. So altogether, it was a very instructive experience, and that was in '71.
All right.
Then I went off, '72 to '73, I went off to Seattle for a leave of absence, and busy on other projects. And in the meantime, that article got published, but I didn't do anything further with this. Then on the way home, I had a heart attack in '73, in the summer of '73, in Montreal, and I came back to recover. And while I was home recovering, by the way, even while I was in the infirmary, when I came home from Montreal, I went first to the infirmary here. Steve came by to visit me and to encourage me to continue this work, you know, to say this is very, very important. You know, there was a very definite division of labor between me and Steve. I was kind of always small, you know, I was thinking small. You know, I saw this, you know, these are exercises, and, you know, if you accumulate them and you do more and more things of this sort, you will be making a marginal contribution, and that's worth it. I mean, you know, I came out of the civil rights movement, you know, with particularly CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, where every sit-in, every, you know, every demonstration, it doesn't change the macro picture overnight, but that's what it's all about. You do small things, and eventually they add up to a larger impact. And that's the way I looked at workshops. Yeah. But Steve always had the big picture in mind. You know, he you know, I mean, he was always very ambitious and saw the potential.
Yeah. Peace in the Middle East.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I kind of, you know, to me the big word was contribution. Yeah. You know, we want to make a contribution. And if we can make a contribution, that's all I'm looking for. I don't care for it. I mean, I wouldn't mind, but I'm not aiming to do the breakthrough. Yeah. You know, that's not what we're about. This is too far removed from where the action is, but it's a contribution. You know, you work with people, and these people influence other people, and you have an input into the larger culture.
But I mean, the other culture that you were beginning, I think, to impact at that particular point, and it was a very long process, an incremental process, was, you know, the culture of the field of conflict resolution, getting the idea of workshops and involvement accepted. I mean, I remember more or less the same time feeling, well, working with John, still trying to do this sort of thing in London, that it was almost not respectable, even in the field of conflict resolution as it then was. So did you get the feeling that you were building up a credibility of this as a respectable academic thing to do? And what were some of the difficulties with that?
Well, I think the big difference probably is that everything is so much larger here. And so there was always room for all kinds of deviance, you know, to a greater extent. You know, it wasn't, you know, you weren't one of 3 professors of international relations in the country. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but
not too much of an exaggeration.
But you know, particularly at that time, and so I think there was always greater room for deviation, but I myself was not aware. Of course, I'm not in the field of international relations.
No, but I mean, you were contributing to the field of conflict resolution, so...
Yeah, but I mean, I can say this, for example. I mean, if we go get a little bit ahead of my story. I need to come back to '73, but a little bit ahead of my story. In you know, in '76, I was invited to join the Center for International Affairs here at Harvard, and not on the basis of this work. That was hardly known at that time. You know, I was doing it, but it was hardly visible. at that time, but on the basis of my book, you know, International Behavior, and the fact that I'd worked kind of on the social psychology of international relations. And let's see, by that time, I was also active in the International Studies Association. At some point, close to that time, I was elected president of the International Studies Association. All of this, you know, I was benefiting from the fact that I was one of the very few psychologists doing this, and the International Studies Association wanted to maintain its character and image of an interdisciplinary organization. So, so as a psychologist, I had a much better chance of being president than I would have if I'd been a political scientist. Boulding had been president a couple of years earlier, and again, you know, there weren't that many economists, although there were more economists than psychologists. And so I was invited to join the Center for International Affairs as a member of the executive committee, which was a nice deal at that time because they paid half of my salary, I think, if I'm not mistaken, for a while, or a third. I can't remember what it was, but
it was something.
A sizable sum of my salary. That later dropped out. But you know, so I had. You know, I had respectability within the field, and of course, you know, the book International Behavior was widely. I know I kept over the earlier years meeting people who were getting degrees in international relations all over the world. They said, "Oh, you were part of my prelim preparation," you know. So, so I think that. You know, I was sort of respectable as an outsider in the field of international relations, but enough of an insider to be president of the International Studies Association and to be a member, you know, executive committee member of the Center for International Affairs, both of which were outfits that wanted to maintain an interdisciplinary character. So in a sense that, as I said, gave me an advantage. But then when I started doing, you know, raising funds to do this work and doing it, I always did it under the auspices of the center. The center didn't invest any of its funds in it, but they gave me, you know, they administered my funds, they gave me the name of the center, they gave me the prestige of the center to do it, and there was never a moment. I mean, I cannot think of any moment over the many years that I've been affiliated with the center and doing this work under the auspices of the center where anyone was ever troubled by it. But I think that's because, you know, I wasn't really competing for the status of the person who had much more trouble than I had, much more trouble, serious trouble, was Karl Deutsch. Because Karl Deutsch was ahead of his time as being a quantitative IR person in a department that was very traditional. And so Karl Deutsch really, I think, felt over the years being marginalized in international relations at Harvard. So this does happen here, but it didn't happen to me because I was not in the Department of Political Science, basically, and it didn't happen around this work.
Well, I'll let you get back to 73 in a minute, but I mean, the part of my reason for asking this is because I'm astonished by the way in which, you know, from the 70s up until now, you know, the idea of a field of conflict resolution as a respectable intellectual field has been almost completely accepted everywhere. I mean, you know, people use the language, op-ed writers use the language. You know, people struggle to get into departments of conflict resolution now to get degrees in it. And I mean, to me, that the progress on that has absolutely been astonishing. And I mean, to some degree, it's been because of people, you know, such as yourself, who've come into the field from other disciplines and made the field through the work that you've done. But so, you know, I'm always curious about, you know, the respectability and credibility factor, because we had a real struggle about that in London. But Go on with...
I might say that within the field of psychology, excuse me, I have had, early on, some, I wouldn't call them problems, but I mean, some people making noises. But that was not relating to the conflict resolution work, but relating to the idea of psychological study of issues in war and peace. Where, I mean, on the one hand, I remember distinctly one rather important person in the field who obviously was very wrong, saying, you can't just come in and start a new field in psychology. He was so wrong. I mean, after he said that, the whole field of ecological psychology developed, all sorts of new fields developed. But he kind of felt that there was something wrong with somebody coming in there and trying to create, I mean, it wasn't just me, but the people with me, trying to create a new subfield. Now, of course, there is a division of peace psychology. It's a very broad field. And there were also those people more in my own, even within social psychology, who kind of felt that you should be doing experiments, and that's what you should be doing. That's what we were all about. You shouldn't be, trying to deal with things that are really not part of our discipline and not disciplined work. But there, I remember one person who specifically said that and who said, but it's all right for you to do it because you have paid your dues. Because, I'd done experimental work, and I had published and I had achieved, before I got into this work, I had already established myself. Of course, since then I've disestablished myself, but...
but we know you can really do it if you want to.
We know you can do it, but you shouldn't be misleading these young people who haven't done their homework yet, who haven't really paid their dues yet. So, but interestingly enough, within psychology, interestingly enough, the work on conflict resolution makes more sense than just the analysis of war and peace. Analysis of war and peace seems like, you're really going beyond the scope of the field. But this is a hands-on approach, working with people in groups, which is continuous with all kinds of psychological practice. Starting with group therapy and small group, encounter groups. I mean, it's continuous. It's a form of practice. It's not research per se, but it's a form of practice which is acceptable within the wider field. So in psychology, that is more, actually brings the work, the concern with issues of war and peace closer to the mainstream of the field than might otherwise be the case.
Okay, so...
so 73 came another turning point. 66 for me, I'm again talking personally, 66 was meeting John Burton, and 73 was another war. It was the 1973, the October War, and I was at the time, I guess I was back home, having had my heart attack, and recuperating, but having developed a new idea. And that new idea was that I may not live forever. That was a very new idea. I've since tried to forget it, but at that time, it was sort of something on my mind. And there was the war on the screen, and I remembered the words that this guy told me in Israel about, don't do it with your left hand. And I said, well, if I'm ever going to do it with my right hand, now is the time. And I kind of made a decision. I think it was a combination of the war and my my recent heart attack, perhaps with some of the prodding from Steve Cohen, that I decided, okay, I'm going to make that a major part of my agenda. And there, of course, it was a combination of developing the work and applying it to the Middle East. I mean, this was a package for me, and both were equally important. I mean, in a sense. And so, but, and of course I continue to maintain an interest in other conflicts, and I certainly maintain an interest in developing the methodology.
Yeah.
But the Middle East was, you know, kind of accepted by, you know, part of the package was that I would be concentrating on the Arab-Israeli conflict. So, and that's when I went out and started to, you know, do things more systematically, including, you know, there was one thing I was considering, but unfortunately didn't do because I was too busy, and that was learning Arabic. One of the nice things is that it's not a differentiating factor between Israelis and Palestinians. You find some Palestinians whose English is considerably better than that of some Israelis, and of course vice versa. But so it's not the case. It's a second language for both of them. But you know, they can do it, and some of them can do it very well. So, but I never got around to really learning Arabic. But we did do a lot of traveling in the Arab world, and I got to know many people. And my affiliation with the Center for International Affairs was absolutely essential there because I made contact with people. And you know, the thing that we didn't have in '67 when John and I were trying to see if we can work out something, I really began to develop. Starting with, I mean, in Israel I had contacts before, but Egypt, Jordan, Palestinian community, Syria, Lebanon, I started with nothing. And I remember I like to tell this story, you probably heard it before, that I know exactly when I became a Middle East specialist. So, you know, because around the world there are now people who think that that's what I am. You know, who and of course I claim that I'm just an amateur. But the moment when it happened was back in when was it? Was it 1981 when Sadat was assassinated? 1981. And I was, and you know, the media were trying to get everybody to talk about what was happening and so on. And I was in on a sort of a TV interview together with another person. And the issue was, what is the impact, what may be the impact of Sadat's assassination on the peace process? We were already talking about that, peace process back in 1981. And so while this was going on, I did a naughty thing that I'm not supposed to do, which was to look at the screen. You know, you're not supposed to look at the screen while you're being interviewed or while you're appearing. Anyway, I looked at the screen, and there was my picture, talking head. And under my picture, it said, Herbert Kelman, Middle East specialist, Harvard University. So that's when I knew that I was a Middle East specialist. But anyway, I definitely, you know, and I have been since '77. I've been running the Middle East seminar, now co-chairing them. I'm still doing that, co-chairing the Middle East seminar at the Center for International Affairs, and you know, from, you know, I've sort of been the Middle East person at the Center for International Affairs. So this has definitely been a central part of my career. Of course, when I was teaching other things too, but this course on international conflict, which sort of became, which, you know, met in this room over the years, you know, became one of my trademarks, of course. You know, as a teacher, I had sort of a trademark undergraduate course, which was not in that field, but.
Okay, I'm going to take you back now to the beginning, you know, of your involvement in the field, and thinking back to that time, what do you think the hopes and dreams of people like you and Arthur Gladstone were And do you think you've fallen short of those, or that the field has fallen short? What were people in that time thinking would be, in 40, 50 years' time we would like to see? And have you seen it on a sort of personal level, or what do you think the field was trying? What do you think Kenneth was trying to do, and Dan Katz and all of those people?
Well, without, that's actually an easy question. Now, because, without making any judgment about the significance of what all of us are doing, and without making any judgment about how much we have actually contributed to peace, which is, the ultimate test.
That's what we're trying to do.
But if I leave these things out and simply ask myself the question, the question that you asked back in 1951, 52, I could not have dreamt that this would be such a big field. Again, I'm not talking about how successful it is in terms of the ultimate purpose. I have opinions about it, but just the idea that there would be so many people engaged in this, that so many organizations and journals and research activities, practice activities, teaching programs, concepts that have evolved, findings that have been generated. I could not possibly. I didn't even have the concept of imagining that. So I think from that point of view, if the idea was to, our idea was not to create a field. Certainly not at the beginning. Our idea was to get people in existing fields to devote energies and efforts to this kind of work. And I think what happened certainly went well beyond anything that I was able to imagine at that time.
What do you think were the major reasons it's grown so much? I've been trying to sort this out in my own mind. Were there particular breakthrough points, or were there particular people, or were there particular institutions? You've mentioned, Michigan. You've mentioned Stanford, Center for Advanced Behavioral Research Studies. Your work here, John's work in London. Who else would you say were crucial? Who else do you think played a role in this expansion? Because I have the same feeling that you have. Thinking back to the mid-60s when I got involved in this. The idea, it was a struggle then to be somebody in Britain who was a behavioral international relations specialist. But the idea that there would be a field of conflict analysis and resolution, or peace studies, or whatever it was just forget it. And I've been trying to work out what happened and how it happened and why it happened. And, who did all of this? Who did all of this?
It's an interesting question. I don't know. It would be a very, very interesting question to try to deal with systematically in terms of the history of ideas and all of that. One thing is that I think this is not in any. I hadn't really thought about this systematically, so I'm just thinking out loud, and it's not in any order of importance or significance, just some random thoughts that I'm, trying to generate here. One thing that I think contributed is that there were, and you know, that goes back to my experience in 54, 55 in Palo Alto, you know, at the center, that there were people, and it goes back to Richardson, you know, to Louis Richardson, that there were people who were working in established fields that were able to use methods that are, you know, accepted in those fields and that have a certain scientific aura, you know, because they're quantitative methods and they involve calculus and so on and so forth, and a history of having been successfully, I suppose, employed in the natural sciences and in economics, I think, and to a certain degree in psychology. That so there were people who were rooted in these fields with reputations and with impeccable credentials, who decided to apply these methods to problems in this field. And so they brought with it, you know, I mean, in a sense, they brought with it an aura of respectability, which, you know, I mean, they appealed at the same time to people who came into this not because this, you know, was following the line of scientific investigation. They came into it for reasons of social concern and ideological concerns and so on, but they had sort of some base of respectability. They could not be laughed out of the court because they were able to, you know, to use respectable methods. They still had problems of the kind that, as I mentioned, Carl Deutsch had here, because quantitative methods were not acceptable at that time in the traditional government department. But that has, of course, changed radically. You know, I mean, he was well ahead. I mean, today, you can hardly, you know, today it's the other way around.
Yeah, right.
You can't find, even at Harvard, you know, you can't find a historical, that's the way to go. So I think that this is one of the things that helped the field, that it had respectable methodologies, in a way. Now, another thing that I think helped, I think, and this is, you know, something I've actually written about in kind of my ideas about the history of the peace research movement, that you also had, you know, within the traditional field of international relations, a search for, you know, more systematic methodologies. I mean, as you had gradually in political science as a whole, you know, a search for particularly quantitative methodologies and more systematic kind of approaches. And the place they went to, you know, were these people. These were the people who were doing it. And so you had also a development, you know, it fit into, I think, an intellectual need within the discipline of international relations, which in a sense was coming to a dead end with the total reliance. I mean, not that these are not very, very relevant still, but the total reliance for that discipline on historical and normative kinds of approaches. And so I think, you know, it was a coming together of the people who needed these new methods and people coming from other fields who had these methods that, in a sense, I think created this, what's the word? There's a word for it, which I can't think right now.
Nexus? Is that the
word? Whatever it is,
like
you know,
that,
it created this dynamic. I think that made a lot of difference. I think another factor certainly was that both within academia, I think partly in response to the 60s, and within governments, there was a kind of you know, a quest for social relevance. I mean, it came out of different origins, but you know, as governments, you know, were, and at least this was true in this country. I don't know how it is elsewhere, but in this country, as there was a greater development of various kinds of social programs, there became a request for evaluation, you know, for evidence that these programs work, and so you had, in a sense, socially relevant research. Had a, you know, there was an interested party out there willing to provide funding for it. I think sort of the availability of funds. I think foundations, of course, made a contribution here. I think that MacArthur Foundation in its earlier days, Ford, Carnegie, and particularly Hewlett then in later days, I think that made a contribution. I mean, even if we go back to the early days, you know, I mentioned the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. Well, that was a Ford Foundation project. I mean, Ford Foundation practically invented the idea of behavioral science. Well, I mean, they pushed it. I mean, they pushed it. There has been, I think, over the years, a greater openness to interdisciplinary fields. But I mean, there are all kinds of factors, but so much work, particularly work that requires, you know, a lot of technology, has become interdisciplinary, and I think there are more institutes and places, and so I think that provided a more favorable atmosphere for work that is by its very nature interdisciplinary. So I think there are a lot of factors, but I think we have to keep in mind that really we aren't talking about a single field, and that's, I mean, at the very least, we kind of have to make a distinction between peace research, which in itself is now, in a way, what we used to call it peace research, but I think there's a big distinction now between peace research and peace studies, where, you know, the peace research tends to be more quantitative and more formalized, and so on, and peace studies tends to be more the field that belongs to perhaps historians and literary people and so on. I don't know. I mean, you know, there is. I sort of, you know, don't keep up that much with peace studies, but there is in this country a Society for Peace Studies which really isn't into the quantitative side at all, and the peace research, or peace science, as you know, Walter Isaac prefers to call it, has really become very much quantitative and formalized, and so on. But that is different from the field of conflict resolution, which, I mean, you know, as I said before, I mean, to me, I feel that I'm rooted in both of these. You know, I mean, it's sort of my interest in conflict resolution came out of peace research, but so much of conflict resolution is now really, you know, I mean, it's practice oriented, and that's really fairly remote from peace research.
Yeah, one of the things about conflict research, conflict resolution, is it always has this intense practical applied side of things. I mean, not just the work that, you know, you and I do, but the whole basis seems to be take it out into the real world. But I guess this takes you into the larger question that you were talking about earlier. How successful do you think it's been, not in terms of just creating a field, but of actually having an impact? And when you go back into your early recollections of the work that you started up as a young man, you obviously had...
Well, that's an awfully tough one.
Yeah.
Because, you know, clearly we don't have less conflict. You know, there's a tremendous amount of, I mean, conflict, I mean, deadly conflict. I'm not concerned about conflict. I mean, we all agree that conflict is a good thing, but it's conflict, it's violent conflict and deadly conflict. We have a tremendous amount of it. I mean, you know, this is the old cliche that the kind of, the internal conflicts, intra-societal, intranational conflicts, ethnic conflicts, and other sort of conflicts between identity groups have actually, increased in the post-Cold War era.
Yeah.
So we have, I mean, if that's going to be our criterion, has the level, has the number, and the intensity, and the level of violence, and the level of the number of deaths and the refugees created, and all of these things, have they noticeably reduced in the years since this kind of work has been going on? Well, I don't think we can show that. But, on the other hand, of course, one could say it would have been worse if we hadn't been there. Well, I don't really know how you can demonstrate that. I mean, I have to take kind of an intermediate indicator of success, if you will, and that is that there are organizations and peoples and programs and so on that are actively concerned with trying to deal with these issues systematically. I think, have they increased at the same rate as the deadly conflicts have increased? I don't know. But I think that there is a kind of a level of awareness and a set of approaches and methods and so on that hasn't been there before, and that is now available. But I must say that it's very easy to get depressed, and at what we have not achieved. I mean, I think the world is still a god-awful place. I mean, considering, the presence of genocides and I mean, continuing, refugee problems, active warfare, civilian deaths, stunted lives. I mean, it's awful. It's really awful. It's very hard to say under these circumstances that we have been successful. But it's really a question of what criteria you use. I mean, I guess my measure of the only measure that I can use is that we have more means. I like to believe we have more means for preventing and dealing with these kinds of conflicts, and both, some degree of knowledge, some degree of methodology or technology or whatever you want to call it, some degree of organizational facilities and trained personnel and so on, that this is what we have in place. But, as you know from my own kind of effort to push the concept of a facilitating service, as you recall, following in John Burton's footsteps, I still feel the need for some such organization, although it's more complicated because, the way in which John visualized it and the way in which I visualized it, it was kind of focused on a particular technique, if you will, and a particular kind of group of people who would be involved in it, whereas what has happened in the field is that you have a growing number of organizations that are, use multiple techniques. I mean, Search for Common Ground is the best example of a U.S.-based institution. International Alert is the best example, perhaps, of an organization in the European context. So you have more and more of these organizations which look at conflict resolution from the point, which use a variety of techniques and approaches and so on, of which perhaps, interactive conflict resolution or, analytic problem solving or whatever you want to call it, is part of the repertoire. And on the whole, I feel that's probably a good development. I mean, because we shouldn't be relying on a technique. And nor would I feel that, if I still think the facilitating service that we came up with would be a good institution, precisely because it is specialized and can perform that specialized task. But I don't see it under any circumstances as a substitute for any of these other kinds of activities, which I feel, good. The more, the better, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, Ron is still pushing that and still trying to get it organized. So we'll see whether he comes up with anything. Okay, bringing you back from the past, do a bit of crystal ball gazing. What do you think is going to happen in the future for the field, for facilitated problem solving, or whatever we're calling it? What sort of things can you see in the future? What sort of hopes would you have for the future? What sort of aspirations?
Well, let me say, first, in a way, almost partly taking back what I just said, when I said that, the more the better, and these are all, these are all good developments. I do have a little bit of concern about becoming overly institutionalized. I certainly have a concern about developing this field, and certainly this would be true for interactive conflict resolution or what have you, of developing this into a kind of a set technology that gets applied and so on. I think there is some advantage to the way in which it has operated in the early days, where you have these small entrepreneurs who yes, have the disadvantage of operating on a shoestring and have obviously certain a lot of shortages in terms of the means at their disposal and so on. But there's some advantage in that, and of having such programs university-based, where you can sort of be at the cutting edge of thinking about things and so on. And some of that creativity can become lost once you institutionalize it, and particularly once you form large institutions with large budgets and so on. And I might say the same thing is true. If you institute various kinds of standards, professional standards that exercise control. I think these are vital. If there's anything that worries me more than what I just now said, it is people going around practicing who don't have the training and don't have the sensitivity, and who kind of, so we do need standards. We do need educational programs, and we do need some kind of professional organizations with professional standards. We do need that. I mean, I've watched these issues sort of more or less on the side, but in the field of clinical psychology and psychotherapy, and I'm very well aware of the fact that we need standards, but you also pay a price for it.
Sure.
and so I'm a little bit concerned about that. But what was I was wandering off a little bit.
No, you were saying, you know, looking at the future, you know, things that slightly worried you, but other things which you think perhaps were hopeful signs of further developments. Where, you know, where do we go from here, I guess, is the basis of the question.
Yeah.
What would you like to see over the next decade, say?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you know, I mean, this may be a very very parochial kind of response, but I would sort of hope that the connection between academia and NGOs that kind of has marked this field, perhaps because it is so relatively young, I would hope that that doesn't completely get broken. You know, I mean, I think, well, again, it's more of what I said before, that that I think that there has to be a mechanism, a place for continued growth, you know, continued creativity and thinking, and sort of not getting everything so heavily routinized. And I think there's always a danger that when you get a field that is organized and professionalized and so on, that some of that new thinking may be aborted, and that would be a danger. But you know, I mean, there's no simple answer to it. I mean, there's no. I certainly, you know, I mean, the very fact that I've been kind of promoting the idea of you know, of a large-scale NGO means that I feel the need to go in that direction. But I also am aware of the potential cost. I mean, this is one of the things that I would like to, you know, just kind of keep in mind. I mean, I think that's a problem for all professions, and so you know, I think that in the earlier years we've had both the advantages and the disadvantages of being not being a profession, of being a profession kind of in the making, and I'm all in favor of getting rid of some of the disadvantages, and I'm hoping that we can somehow, you know, preserve the advantages. I don't know exactly what is the way to do this, and I'm also very well aware of the fact that you know, I don't want to kind of be you know, stuck in romantic notions about the good old days, and how do we maintain them?
Yeah, it's interesting how these things come about. But I have a student at the moment who is writing a PhD about creativity, and I'm thinking to myself, on the one hand, how can you be creative about creativity? I mean, how do you study creativity if you've never been creative in your life? But okay, do you have any dreams you'd like to finish and fulfill while you're still around and you're still working and you're still? What's your next step in the field?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if in terms of dreams while I'm still around and so on, I mean, you know, there is the one dream that I just talked about that I've made public about the facilitating service. I mean, I don't know where that will go, and it may very well be that it won't be a thing in a sense where one can say, okay, here it is.
Yeah.
It may very well be that that what it will be is a function, a function that will be fulfilled in different ways and in different places and by different means. And as far as I'm concerned, that's fine. I mean, I'm concerned about the function. I'm not concerned about the, an organization with that name and, with its own building and its own headquarters and all of that. But that makes it harder to have a dream of it. In other words,
It's very dreamlike.
it is dreamlike. But I mean, I would like to see that function kind of accepted and understood and utilized. I mean, that would be a kind of a dream that I would have. But as I said, I mean, it's something that you won't be able to necessarily put your finger on it. And that would be fine in principle, but I mean, it would be fine in principle and in practice.
Yeah.
It would be fine as far as I'm concerned, but it would be hard to put my finger on it in terms of saying, that dream has been fulfilled. A dream that could be fulfilled, that you could put your finger on, although it would be a little artificial because it's really not a point in time, but it's a process. But you could put your finger on it, would be the establishment of a real Palestinian state. I mean, that's, I mean, you could say it's a member state of the UN. That kind of is a concrete thing that you could put your finger on and that I could dream about. I mean, knowing that it's a process. I mean, becoming a member of the UN is obviously not the end of the process. But that would be a dream. In earlier years, particularly going back, say in the heady time of the 1993 or so of the Oslo Accord, maybe even before that, but certainly at that time, I would tell people that my dream, my personal dream, is that I would be the first U.S. ambassador to the Palestinian state. But now it's too late for that, so they probably won't. They probably won't want to put me there in my 80s. But it would still be nice if I was still around when the Palestinian state is established. And my current personal dream is not to be the ambassador, but to be invited to the inaugural event. That would be nice if I could still travel at that time. I just wanted to make one more point that I neglected to mention earlier, and that is that looking at the conflict resolution per se, not the peace research element of it, a thing that I think has been important to the development of the field is that there was a certain set of ideas that has developed over the years more or less independently in a variety of different arenas. With increasing communication between them. And I'm talking about ideas such as problem solving, analytic problem solving, if you will, dealing with issues through direct interaction, mediation by a trained professional third party, essentially, well, that set of ideas, really. I mean, we have, of course, developed it in the arena of international relations, but it has also developed more or less independently in such fields as family counseling, divorce counseling, alternative dispute settlement in the legal context, labor relations, community relations, environmental issues, issues of fundamental value conflicts, such as the debates about abortion, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's a whole range of domains, I've left out several others, in which you might say that the same set of underlying ideas about dealing with them has developed more or less independently, and and I think there's more and more communication between them, and in a certain sense, well, at least as far as domains is concerned, I mean, conflict resolution training programs, such as the one at George Mason, of course, try to deal with a whole range of arenas in which it can be applied. Of course, certain others, I mean, if you're dealing with kind of therapeutic interventions, that requires another context for training, or if you're dealing with legal interventions, it requires another context of interventions. But there is this whole range, and I think this is one of the things that has contributed to the development of the field, and to its acceptability, because it just has made sense. I think here and there was, to a certain degree, independently. I mean, obviously with mutual influence, but independently arisen in these different domains.
Okay. Yes, good point. I want to go back now to the whole business of identity that you were talking about, because as you said, it can be a very structural or a very personal matter. And you've got all of this huge list of labels, conflict research, conflict resolution, peace studies, peace research, etc., etc. And how do you identify yourself now? I mean, when you think of yourself as somebody who's been through the last several decades of work, came from social psychology, came originally from wanting to do a mixture of sociology and psychology. How do you think of yourself now? Which part of these various fields, subfields, do you think of Herb Kelman is?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I like to think that I am all of them, and I enjoy that. So I mean, like sometimes when somebody asks me, well, who are you, or what are you, and so on, or particularly if they ask me for my title, that's I would say I'm a professor of social ethics. My field is social psychology, and my practice is international relations, and my specialization is in the Middle East. And I like the idea that I'm hard to classify. I still enjoy, for example, I mean, it's very minor enjoyment, but I enjoy getting letters that people send me addressed to the Department of Political Science. I kind of like to be accepted in a variety of fields. But having said all that, if you were to ask me, you can only take one label. I would say social psychologist. And that is, I don't know why I feel that, but it's because, I mean, first of all, it's the field in which I feel that I can really claim that I was trained in that field. I feel I have very clear credentials in that field. I've gotten, I mean, my credentials are getting weaker over the years in the sense that I'm not keeping up with a lot of the literature, and I don't, I'm not quite familiar with a lot of the latest writing or even the latest methodologies and so on. But no one can contest the fact that I was thoroughly trained in a very respectable social psychology program, and I came out of it as a well-trained social psychologist for my time, for the time at which I was trained. And it's a field in which I feel at home. I mean, in the sense that, I mean, like, for example, even sociology as a general field, certainly international relations, certainly political science, certainly ethics, which has been my title since 1968. I've been a professor of social ethics, but I don't know the classics. I haven't read the classics in this field, so I always feel like a little bit of an intruder. I mean, of somebody who is trying to operate in a field in which I I'm not fully embedded. I don't feel that way about social psychology. I feel I'm fully embedded in that field. That is my field, and that, in a sense, becomes my identity. I might also add that there is, by the way, recently I looked at how many of the things that I have written over the years have a subtitle that says, and by the way, courses that I've taught have a subtitle that says a social psychological analysis, a social psychological perspective, social psychological dimensions, etc. In other words, I have operated in many fields, and I like that. That sort of is consistent with it's a self-image that I like to maintain. That I'm not a narrow disciplinarian, and that I touch a variety of different subjects. And I particularly like the fact when people in those fields treat me, think of me as being serious. I think, yes, I mentioned before the first how I felt when Stanley Hoffman used my piece in a book on international relations theory. I like to be taken seriously by people, and so I like that, but I'm operating in these fields, and I feel that my credentials for operating in these fields come from the fact that I'm a social psychologist and I'm applying social psychological concepts and methods to a various degree, and literature in which I am embedded. So in that sense, as I said, if I have to choose a single identity, that's what I would choose. Usually, I'm not restricted that way. So if people ask me, what are you? I usually nowadays say I'm a social and political psychologist. I think that includes the social, but it adds the political to make it very clear that the arena in which I've been operating for many, many years is the political arena. Okay. Now, beyond that, I am, of course, I still make no claim of being a Middle East expert, largely because there are large areas of the Middle East I'm not familiar with, and I'm also not really embedded in the the classical writings and the classical languages and so on. So I don't regard myself as a Middle East specialist per se, but I do like to believe that I'm knowledgeable about the Middle East, at least about the contemporary Middle East. Field of conflict resolution, I feel comfortable in identifying myself with the field of conflict resolution. The field of peace research, as narrowly defined, no, because I'm not doing what is now often seen as peace research. I'm not doing the quantitative research and so on. But broadly defined, particularly going back to its origins, yes, I consider myself to be, in fact, one of the founders in my own way of the peace research movement. I'm still more of a movement person with peace research than a scientist. In the way in which Walter Izard or David Singer would like to think about it. So I don't know if that answers the question.